Welcome to a live episode of Surviving the Survivor. We bring you the best guests in all of true crime. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button. Here's your host, Emmy Award-winning broadcaster, Joel Waldman.
Tonight, a brutal new truth emerges from the Goncalves family on the heels of this plea hearing, and it is tough to stomach. Kaylee, they're saying, didn't just die in her sleep. She fought. She was beaten in the face, stabbed multiple times, all according to her family. Welcome to Surviving the Survivor. This is the show that brings you the very best guests in all of true crime. So we're hearing about these new horrifying details post-plea hearing about the final moments of Kaylee Goncalves' life, and it went from bad to even more unbelievably disturbing, all at the hands of Bryan Kohberger, who admitted to these four absolutely brutal and savage stabbing deaths. The mountain of evidence has grown. We saw the state put on a very mini little trial revealing some of this evidence, and we are going to break it all down with tonight's best guest. First up is an Idaho-based first-time Riley Fry, a deputy federal defender. Please welcome to the show, Riley Fry. He is there. We've got Aaron Tognetti, who is an attorney out of Pocatello and a former prosecutor, and our old friend Anjanette Levy, law and crime host, and also the host of her own YouTube channel, which the COE will put into the chat. If you just search up Anjanette Levy, you will come across it. So Anjanette, I was asking you, you were in court for this plea hearing last week, and you had a perfect, undisturbed view of Bryan Kohberger, to which I said, I'm sorry to hear that, but it is also fascinating as a journalist. I guess what struck you the most during that plea hearing?
Joel, not how still he was, because he's always very still. If you watch the Zoom hearings, that's all we are getting, or were getting for the longest time, were the Zoom hearings. They kicked the TV cameras out of the courtroom. So we had to take what we could get, but just how incredibly still he was. And as Bill Thompson kind of recited his statement of facts, if you will, for lack of a better term, he was transfixed. I mean, I've said this on my own YouTube channel before, and I said it on Law and Crime. He was transfixed, and he was just kind of staring at Bill Thompson, and his eyes were wide open. And I think that that's just how he is a lot of the time, but he did not blink. I don't think he does much blinking anyway, but he did not blink. I think I might have seen him blink twice the entire time Bill Thompson was reading kind of the evidence that they were planning to present at trial, which I'm assuming they have more than what they outlined. But he just sat there, Joel. His eyes were just wide open. He has these really big eyes, and it was like he was in a zone, and there was no breaking him from that. And his eyes were so wide. And it was like, there was no, I don't know if I could have like gone in front of him and done this and broken his gaze. And I was waiting for him to almost say like, well, you didn't get that part right. Or it was stunning to me. And, I know they've said that he has level 1 autism, which is, they used to call it Asperger's, and maybe he does. But people have said, well, that's part of that. It's because he's got this Asperger's or level 1 autism, and that could be very much a part of it. But he's admitted to carrying out these homicides. And I think that you would have to have a certain level of, like iciness to you to do something like this. And you would be able to compartmentalize. And it seemed like he was almost reliving this, and he was kind of transfixed by the description that Bill Thompson was giving.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at these photos right now. People, obviously, they talked about tie knot being exceptionally tight, which I don't know how tight it is. But what about the eyebrows, Anjanette? That was another point of contention. Someone emailed me and said he didn't trim his eyebrows. He shaved his eyebrows. You still see the eyebrows. They're not shaven, but they are extremely closely trimmed. Did you notice that?
Yes, and they look thinner in these photos, I think, than they do in court. However, his haircut. The first thing I noticed when he walked into court was the haircut, because it was so closely cropped on the sides, and obviously they've probably got a barber in the jail. But he got a fresh haircut. I'm assuming he's been maybe asking the barber at the jail to help thin those out, and they look lighter. Like if you were to put the selfie from the morning of the murders up, the thumbs up selfie up next to this, you would see that, and it could be a lighting issue. They were much darker then, and they were much fuller. So I don't know if he's been working on thinning those out. And I was kind of brainstorming in my head, how would you go about lightening the color of your eyebrows if you wanted to? I'm thinking to myself, do they sell some type of toothpaste in the commissary at the jail? Maybe that has peroxide in it, some whitening, like what's going on? Because if you put those pictures side by side, his eyebrows definitely look lighter as well, the color.
Yeah, it is creepy. I just want to say that we're praying for the families in Texas. Absolutely horrific. We have kids at camp. COE took it extra hard this weekend, as I know a lot of people did. Death toll has gone over 100, and 27, I believe, dead from Camp Mystic Camp in Central Texas, and that number is actually expected to rise. So that is terrifying and horrible news as well. But Riley, to you, someone just had a comment in here that this was going to be right here. Our friend Mary McElveen. I think the trial would have been a circus and it would have been his show. Do you agree with that? And do you think it was the right call ultimately to cut this plea deal and avoid this, despite some of the families being incredibly unhappy about it, which we'll get to in a moment? And Riley, that's for you.
Thanks. I think there were a lot of advantages to take a plea agreement in a case like this, to look at doing a settlement, to look at not having to go through the crazy circus. I feel like I'm having some technical issues.
No, you're good. You're good now. You're good.
So, okay. So I think there's a huge advantage of not having to go through the circus, as the comment said, than getting it on the record, getting the plea, and being able to move forward from there. The evidence that the government
you know what, Riley, I think your Wi-Fi is freezing up a little bit. I'm going to have you
at the change of plea hearing was largely circumstantial.
Well, he's COE. I'm going to have you just work on that Wi-Fi. Maybe he can join on his phone. But Aaron, let me ask you: when you were a prosecutor, and I'm not saying Ann Taylor's afraid of this guy, but did you ever have any defendants that were frightening to the point that you feared for yourself? We've seen prosecutors and defense attorneys both attacked by their clients in very recent weeks. But have you ever had a client that you were, I guess, fearful of?
I wasn't really, you can't really do that job and be a prosecutor if you're easily rattled, because for a lot of them, it's kind of their goal. You listen to jail calls and they talk about how they want you dead, things like that. So you kind of get a little bit numb to it. I had one trial that sticks out in my head where the defendant, there was no jury in the room at the time, but he was definitely, it was absolutely an act of intimidation that he was just staring at me. And eventually I almost laughed at him because I could tell he was trying to intimidate me. At the end of that trial, it was interesting because we had a full courtroom. We had the media there every single day of the trial. Verdict came in at 10 p.m. and the whole courtroom is full of media. It's half the courtroom is his people, half the courtroom is the family of the victims. And after that, they kind of, my detective, who was my investigating officer and sat through the trial with me, essentially kind of, acted like my Secret Service and moved me downstairs and alerted the bailiffs when I was out of danger, I guess, because it was really, really hostile afterwards. So, I mean, it's not uncommon. I have heard that sometimes the defendants actually feel like the prosecutors are just doing their job and they blame their defense attorney more when things go sideways. I don't know if that's true. I've just heard that from some defense attorneys who say they've been more afraid of their clients than the prosecutors because they just chalk it up to us doing our job. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah. By the way, Taylor Shaw Business is the one most recently who attacked her defense attorney, not once, but several times. And she's now in charge of defending herself. So that's what happens when you attack your defense attorney. Super Planner Girl is a friend of mine and helps out behind the scenes. And Jeanette, what about this? I think there's no why for horrifying acts of evil like this other than evil itself. It's interesting because I was asking Carm about this. Why him? You know, there's people with autism. There's people who have bad upbringings. There are a lot of recovering heroin addicts. Carm said the same thing, that maybe just evil exists out there. But there are a lot of big questions, Anjanette, that we don't have the answers to, and we might never. Why this house? Why these victims? Did he know any of them? There's a theory kind of floating around there that I'll get to toward the back half of the show. But any thoughts on this, that the why remains on the biggest questions?
Well, you know, I have my own theories because I've been covering this since it happened, and I've kind of pieced together my own theories. I don't think the autism has anything to do with it personally. I think that was his attorneys saying, look, he's got this. They were trying to explain the way he looks in court. They were trying to get the death penalty stricken, and that's why they were bringing this up. And if he had been convicted at trial and it had gone to the penalty phase, they were going to use that as a mitigating factor and to explain why he didn't react at all to maybe like gory crime scene photos and things of that nature. I mean, this was all discussed in court during motions hearings. But I truly think if everything proves to be true, like that the Dateline special aired about his pornographic searches on the internet for, you know, women being asleep and forced sex with drunk and passed out women. I think it was a sexually motivated crime. And I think it didn't go how he envisioned it, how he planned it. And I think that Maddie was the target and he didn't expect Kaylee there. That's my theory. I think this whole thing went sideways and spun out of control. Even though the whole thing targeting even one person is sick and demented. But I think that he, for some reason, he had said, you know, on his Tapatalk post when he was a teenager, like he doesn't feel anything and he felt worthless. And I think that maybe this is just this could be somebody with bad wiring. Really bad wiring. That happens. There are just some people who are just born and there's something just not right. I know his sisters are, I think, both in the mental health field, if I'm not mistaken. We don't know much about his upbringing other than we've heard his parents were supportive and his dad got him into treatment for the heroin addiction and stuff like that. So I don't know. He, you know, could just be really bad wiring.
Yeah. Also, we had Dr. G on. Dr. G Explains, JP Garrison, big YouTuber, and he reads body language. We did a fascinating show with him Friday. He said essentially the same thing. Look, there's just evil that persists in people. It's hard to make sense of it. And maybe he's just one of those really bad apples. Dr. Vonda K, always in the chat. We appreciate this. 5 surviving the survivor memberships. It is Monday. Feels like a Monday. Riley, to you, I don't want to push my luck. If you can flip your phone sideways, it'd be great. If not, don't worry about it. Glad to have you back here. There we go. Perfect. Just like that. So you were saying, and now we should have a clear audio and picture of you. Just want you to get your thought in there about the plea agreement, if you think it was the right deal. Jamie here with a super chat for Jeanette. So there you go. Yes. So Riley, nice. Yeah. So Riley, your thoughts on this plea agreement?
I think the plea agreement has a lot of benefits to it. I recognize there may be some frustration from some perspectives that maybe justice isn't being meted out. But it comes down to what a jury will do with it. And you heard the government's proffer at the change of plea hearing. A lot of their evidence is circumstantial evidence. And so that means that the government then has to make sure that the jury can connect those pieces together. And although I think the evidence is strong, that you still don't know what a jury is going to do with that. And so in a case like this, where you're looking at all these other expenses of going through a trial, going through a sentencing, going through appeals that could last for decades, this ensures that there is closure, there is an end result. So I think in a lot of ways this was a good decision.
Yeah. By the way, a lot of new people in the chat tonight, so we welcome you. Thanks for being here. If you don't know STS, we are the show that has the best guests in true crime day in and day out, and we do a live panel show around this time each day. Fridays, it's in the afternoon. So Aaron, to you, let's before we get to breaking down some of the newer information that we got, let me go back to sort of a prosecutorial argument, and that is there is no direct link. I guess the touch DNA is there. We found out how they got that touch DNA, which we'll get to in a moment, but no real direct link between Bryan Kohberger and these victims. Although Anjanette has her theory, and a lot of people do, that this was perhaps sexually motivated, although Dr. G said the opposite. There is no sexual assault that we know of, no murder weapon recovered. So the defense had this crazy, alibi. They had the alternate suspect theory. They were getting kind of beaten down by Judge Hippler toward the end. Was it just the case of this is a dead end for us at this point? We need to plea. And there's other information out there today that I'm teasing that we'll get to in a minute that might be one of the answers. But from a prosecutorial standpoint, did they hit the end of the proverbial road there?
I think that the most important thing, and I know that, I told you guys, Riley and I have been up against each other in trial probably 6 or 7 times. and as good a case as you have, and even when you have attorneys that, we know what we're doing in the courtroom, you can't ever guarantee an outcome from a jury, no matter how good the evidence. Would I have tried this case? Absolutely. If they came to me and said, he'll go to prison for the rest of his life if you just don't put him to death, that's something I would have argued strongly to the family, because of that, even if it's a 5% that the jury is going to get hung up on something small and do what you don't expect them to do, then to have the sure thing, it's the bird in the hand versus the 2 in the bush. You know exactly what you're getting. And then I don't think we can underestimate enough I've seen so many victims' families almost go into like a stasis during trial, during prosecution. And this is even when survivors are, when victims are alive, and victims of different kinds of crime. I've seen them just sort of put therapy on hold, put things like that on hold. We just need to get through the trial. Well, what do you do when it's a death penalty case? You get you're guilty, and yet there's no closure. There's no closure because now you're going to spend the next 25 years going after appeal after appeal. Are you going to put your life on hold for the next 30 years? And I think that's, if it had been me and if I'd had that time with the family, that's what I would have stressed, is nothing is going to make this right. It's one of the comments said there's no excuse for this kind of evil, and there isn't. And so there really isn't going to be peace for this family. And I think that a 30-year-old spending the next, 50 years, if he lives that long, in prison is justice. I think that it is justice. And more importantly, he's waiving appeals, which means this is actually done. This will actually be over for these poor families, right? It's just so tragic. But I don't think that can be underestimated, that they get to now, however they can, begin to move on. Because like I say, I've seen so many that it's almost like they see healing for when this is all done. But if you've got appeals for the next 25 years, then it's almost like they waste their life in the pursuit of vengeance. That's kind of what it feels like. And so more than anything, that's what I hope, is that they do find peace in this, especially the Goncalves family, which I know is really having a hard time with the plea deal. And that's what I just would really hope, that they kind of find some peace in that they would really sacrifice their own lives for what they see as justice. And that would be another tragedy on top of everything else.
Yeah, and that's a very difficult part of the apple to chew on there for the Goncalves family, which I'm going to get to right now. Denise Miller, thank you for this, and thank you to McSpunky. He's been a long time community member. So, Riley, to you, this is a question that I just asked. I'm curious to get your take. A lot of whys, the big whys. Why did he do this? Why did he target this house? Why these victims? They will never be answered. But do you think we would have gotten those answers in a trial? Someone made the point we wouldn't have gotten them in the trial anyway. What do you think?
I don't see how they would have gotten to a motive. An element of the crime is a motive, but it's really just malice aforethought. So he intended to kill them. That's all the motive that he would have needed to have had. Why he chose them, why he chose those 4 people, why he targeted that house. Aside from him getting on the stand and confessing to why he did those things, that's something that we may never know. And that may bother people, but there's evil out there, and it's not always explainable.
Yeah. Riley, by the way, you've got the same last name as the former Moscow police chief, so I got to ask you, are you related? Any relation to, I think it's James Fry, correct?
Maybe. There's Fries from between Utah to Washington, so who knows?
Yeah, well, there you go. So there's a lawyerly answer. He did stand up. He just said he was guilty of this. That's all he really had to do. But Riley, another question that someone in the chat had, which is a great question. Do we now know all the aspects of this deal, or are there aspects of this plea deal that the public is not privy to?
That's a good question. And what was said in open court is what you can hang your hat on. So the colloquy that the judge goes through, there's been a plea agreement, it's been signed, it's written out. I'll go through the specifics of it. There's not going to be some hidden clause or hidden aspect that's going to impact things. They need to go through every pertinent detail in that change of plea hearing, because that's the record for moving forward with anything afterwards. So if he were to come later and say, my attorney screwed up and I didn't want to do that, and I wasn't of sound mind or body or whatever, they would go back to that recording and back to that transcript and say, well, the judge asked you this question, the judge asked you this question, you responded affirmatively all the way down. So the record is so strong that you can't come back later and say, I didn't know what I was doing.
Okay, that's understandable. And I agree to the extent that you go through all the machinations of a trial, and I don't know that we're going to get the absolute answers. And to Aaron's point, look, trials are not foolproof, and you get jurors sometimes who see something differently. Imagine if this guy got off after now admitting it, and despite admitting it, there are even people out there still who believe in his innocence, which is, Angela, let me ask you about that. We see that in just about every trial now. You get the conspiracy theorists. It's getting old at this point, in my opinion, but there is a chance that there would be someone on this jury who would say, look, he wouldn't have pled guilty, obviously, if the trial went on, but who would say there's no way this guy did it. There are already alternate theories out there, none accepted by the court. But what about these conspiracy theorists in general, Anjanette, that are popping up everywhere, left and right now?
Yeah, it does seem that in many cases, maybe not every case, but in the really big high profile cases, there's typically some conspiracy theories. And I think that this case, probably is perfect for that, just because it was so mysterious. And you had, the defense questioning this unknown male DNA found in the house and why it wasn't tested early on. And then that spins out of control. And then this whole case from the very beginning took on a life of its own on social media, and people trying to solve it on chat boards. They were implicating and trying to say fraternity brothers carried out the crime. I mean, I think Bryan Kohberger was trying to point the finger with his alternate suspects potentially at fraternity brothers, from my reading of the documents, which were heavily redacted. So there were so many questions in the beginning. And I just think that people are so, I don't get it. I don't know if they're so unwilling to look at what is before us. I think there's reason, and you should be skeptical, especially in these big cases. You should look at the evidence with a skeptical eye. But as we were learning more and more about the evidence in this case, even though it was a circumstantial case, sometimes circumstantial cases can be very, very powerful. So I don't know why the conspiracy theories are just spinning out of control in some of these high profile cases. But there are many people who still are coming to me on my, YouTube channel and saying that he admitted this under pressure. This was, he's innocent. He did not do this. How can I not see that he didn't do this? I sat right there in the flesh and watched him stand up and admit to this. So there was somebody today telling me he was protecting his parents, and that's why he pleaded guilty. So I don't get it. I did want to come back to one thing. Joel, you mentioned that there was no sexual assault here, and that is 100% true and accurate. When I said earlier that this was a sexually motivated crime, I believe that was the motive. But you're right, there was no, sexual assault here, but I still believe it was a sexually motivated crime.
Yeah, I understand that. I get it. In the courtroom, apparently he made no eye contact with his family. Did you notice that or not notice it? Because we're going to get into maybe why that was.
I did when he first walked in, when he first came in the door, and I was sitting here and his parents were over here to my left in the front row. You could not see them on camera. I was kind of tweeting and typing. So when he first entered, I did not see him, but I did not see him make any contact with them at all once my head was up. So I thought that was interesting. His mother and his father were both there. And, as you can imagine, his attorneys have said many times they support him, they love him, and they had to sit there and watch him admit that he carried out this heinous crime. So you could tell it was a very difficult day for them.
Yeah, and we're going to get to a Facebook post from the Goncalves family in just 1 second. But Brittany Judd here to Riley, will information from the case be available after sentencing, or will it be sealed heretofore? We're never going to know some of this information that maybe would have come out in the trial, or maybe would have been unsealed. Is it now going to stay sealed?
So that's a good question. And a person can always ask him for do requests. So it's called a FOIA request. And I don't, at the change of plea hearing, I don't recall the judge mentioning anything about sealing a record or sealing the record. Right now, it's currently closed off. I don't really say sealed because that's not, that has legal meaning. But it's closed off from people being able to access the online Idaho database and looking at those records. I suspect once a sentencing hearing is complete that there'll be lots of media asking for records, and I think that they'll be able to get those records.
All right. Well, we might be one of them, STS. So we're going to hop on that and try to FOIA some information. But Aaron, to you, I think if someone like BK and Chris Watts, family annihilator, don't get the death penalty, no one should. To the prosecutor, I guess that could be you or Riley, but it's coming to you, Aaron. Why wasn't his full confession, even to the prosecutors, the prosecutors, not a requirement? Why wasn't that like at least part of the deal? Maybe not in open court, but that he had to put something in writing to say, yeah, this is why I did it. This is who I was aiming to get, et cetera, et cetera.
I think that we've kind of talked about this a little bit before, but I think that one of the things, I've seen it used with the plea agreement where they'll use it to find a body, so that the family can get some closure. It depends so much on what's driving the family, what's driving the victims. Well, we want to know why. We want to know why. If that was something that was constant, it is something that you can negotiate. Sort of like, okay, we'll give you this plea deal, but you have to show us where you buried the body, where the murder weapon is, right? You can work those things into it. We haven't been inside of this. I would also say, and I think, Riley would attest to this too, there's a lot of conversation typically that happens between the defense attorney and the prosecutor, right? It's kind of all of the time. And, that may have been conversations that were had to where if it's an attorney that and you're familiar with, which I would assume that they are, the two in this case are very familiar with each other. If I went to Riley and I said, we just need to understand why. And if Riley, without disclosing any, attorney-client confidentiality, could say, I really don't think I don't think you can have that answer. And if he kind of gave me some inclination that says, this guy he's not playing with a full deck. Anjanette made that comment about how he said he feels nothing, right? And that's a very typical, sociopathic trait, is that your emotions are always down here. So it takes something so extreme to feel anything. And how do you explain that, right? As somebody who would commit something like this for some kind of weird thrill so that they feel something, how are they going to ever give a satisfying answer? And if they're not, and if that was a conversation Riley and I were having on a case, and he said that, then that's probably not something I would have chased after. Because if it's, and if he's given me the best answer he can, but keeping it close to the vest, but still trying to communicate with the prosecutor, that easily could have been a conversation that happened, and that they believed that there is no answer to that question other than he wanted to kill somebody or some people. He wanted to be a Ted Bundy. And that's not, it's just, there's not going to be a satisfying answer to that. So I guess that's what I would say, is that you're right. They absolutely could have said, well, he needs to stand up in court and say what he did and say why. But then again, if they think that the whole deal is going to fall apart for that, and that this is a good outcome for all involved, and it's not going to be a satisfying answer, then I think it might have been one of those that was worth it to let go.
Karen Michael here. Why bother with the death penalty if this is the outcome? Maybe because it's a bargaining chip. Maybe we wouldn't have gotten the plea deal if he didn't know he potentially faced death. And like his hero, Ted Bundy, apparently Bryan Kohberger is terrified of dying despite what he did. And so maybe it was a bargaining chip that happened to work in this case. Is that fair to the Goncalves family? Not necessarily. I learned something from this show every time. And I just saw Riley, to you in the chat, and I don't know if you can confirm this, that inmates in Idaho are forbidden from talking, giving interviews. Do you know if that's true? Is that not true?
That would be not true.
Not okay.
In fact, I think they're just. I just saw an interview on Lori Vallow, who's.
Well, that was in Arizona, and that's what the person in the chat. We'll confirm that, because they said because it was in Arizona, they were able to speak to her, but not in Idaho. So,
I'm unfamiliar with a rule with the Idaho Department of Corrections that disallows them from having media contact. That would simply be something that would be worked through with the Department of Corrections, I would imagine. But I'm not aware of a hard, fast rule one way or the other.
That's, going to upset a lot of people in media, but probably is a good thing to let his oxygen starve him and have him wither away there in prison. But Anjanette, to you. So Kaylee's parents put together a Facebook post, and COE, I can't bring that up because of the new configuration, so I'll have you bring that up. And they make it known publicly, and I think they've talked about it briefly, but this was, an effort by the family to make it abundantly clear that Kaylee was not killed instantly. Her parents say she fought back, and that Bryan Kohberger beat her in the face and head during the attack before fatally stabbing her. The Facebook post pulls no punches. It says he got mercy, Kaylee didn't. It's very long. I'm going to read part of it here. Friends, we are home. Thank you all for your support, love, and prayers. This page is a place of comfort for me, my safe place. You've all been with me for years now and have always stood right next to me. I'll forever be grateful. I am sorry if I don't agree with our recent decisions on the plea deal. Bryan Kohberger literally is too afraid to die, but he wasn't afraid to kill. Bryan Kohberger wanted a plea deal, and he was given one. Kaylee wasn't offered a plea deal. The state is showing Bryan Kohberger mercy by removing the death penalty. Bryan Kohberger did not show Kaylee any mercy. People tell us we should be happy with life in prison without parole, as he will never get out. How is that not a win, they ask? Well, the death penalty also means life on death row. We knew it would be decades before he'd ever face the firing squad. We knew that his execution was not going to happen anytime soon, but his life on death row while serving his time would have been much worse than serving his time as life in prison, and on it goes. And Jeanette, you got to feel for the Goncalves family. Also, the Kernodles, I think, are in the same boat. They wanted this to go to trial. I know you're a journalist. I'm a journalist. You were outside the courthouse, according to COE, when Steve Goncalves was there, and you spoke to him. What sense did you get from him other than, being upset and wanting justice? Did your heart break for this guy?
Yeah, I mean, he was furious. He wouldn't even go into the courtroom. I mean, the guy who was admitting to murdering his daughter was going to admit to it after all of this time, after nearly 3 years, and he refused to go inside. I mean, he went and watched it from a car. So he was livid, and I do feel for them. They said that they were this was mentioned to them on a Friday in a meeting. It sounds like it was like a regular meeting, possibly like on Zoom or something that they would have on Fridays. And they said they were adamant that they did not support a plea agreement. They wanted this to go to trial. They believe that the prosecution should pursue the death penalty. Xana's father felt the same way. He felt that it should go to trial. The other two families, Ethan Chapin's family, Maddie Mogan's family, they supported the plea agreement. And so they were notified apparently by letter in an email on Sunday after it was brought up to them on a Friday. They say that this was happening. And so I feel like, my impression from talking to him is that he felt like this was a huge slap in the face, that this is how this happened. And I know I talked to a special prosecutor who's handled death penalty cases in Ohio. And he said, yeah, you would typically kind of have a sit down. This would be like a pretty long conversation when you would talk about removing the death penalty, especially in a case like this. But the prosecution hasn't come out and talked to us, the media, or any of us about this. So we just know what we're hearing from the Goncalveses. So I do feel for them. As far as the beating of Kaylee, they have said that before. Steve has said that before on another podcast, that Kaylee was punched in the face. We've not heard that in court documents. We've just heard about the stabbing. They've said before that she fought back. So, we need some more information, I think, about that. But it's horrific, and you do have to feel for them. And they've been, how could you not be angry that your daughter's life was taken in such a horrific way, and that she fought back. She was awake and fought back. They said that Maddie, in some court documents, they had an expert who was going to testify that she had no defensive wounds and that she, couldn't fight back, which is so sad too. She had no ability to fight back, according to what was in the court record with some of the documents in the hundreds and thousands of pages of court documents filed in the case. So that's incredibly sad.
And you can see already just from this plea agreement that some things are coming out, like this beating of Kaylee, which really changes the narrative. But Anjanette, one other thing that everyone seems to be talking about, and this is graphic, so I just want to give you a second if you guys are sensitive to this, which we all should be, or more sensitive. But Anjanette, there's talk that Bryan Kohberger also sort of mutilated the legs of Ethan Chapin. Have you learned anything more about that? Did you hear that while you were there? Because that's not something that we had heard previously.
No, that was kind of floating around back when the arrest first happened. That was floating around online in screen grab of a text message that there had been some damage done to Ethan's legs and that it was beyond what killed him. So I don't know much more about that. I know Dateline did some reporting about that there were some markings on his legs. It's like sickening to even talk about it.
Yeah.
So we don't know much more about that. Nobody's said much more about that. Dateline described it as carving in his legs. So we just really don't know. Dateline, I guess their sourcing was pretty good. Keith Morrison said they have most of the evidence in the case that was going to be presented. So we just don't know. Was that out of rage? We have no idea.
Yeah, and we haven't, as far as I know, heard from the two surviving roommates. So you got to think, Riley, that this benefits them. I know at least one of them has been in serious trauma therapy since this happened. Very understandable. They've also been on the receiving end of a lot of hate because of the amount of time it took them to call 911. But it's also about sparing them. These are young victims who were in that house. What your thoughts on that? That they obviously won't have to testify. I think that is a win, as difficult as this is for Steve Goncalves.
Yeah, that's something that as a defense attorney, we think about when we're negotiating a case, when we're talking to a case. In fact, I think there were some cases that I would go to Aaron and I would say, hey, we don't want to put this particular witness on. We know that this is going to be traumatic. And so we would like to look at some type of a resolution. As far as I understand, oftentimes the trauma that a victim experiences testifying is sometimes as great, if not greater, than the trauma that they're exposed to in the initial thing that brings them into court. And especially all of the stuff getting ready and preparing. It's not just the one time that they're sitting in the courtroom getting asked questions, but there's all the thought process beforehand, the meeting with the victim witness coordinator to talk about what they're going to talk about, meeting with prosecutors. There's all of this work leading up to that. And then it's not just telling their story in court. Then they have to have a defense attorney cross-examine them. And some defense attorneys are very aggressive, and some are downright terrible to alleged victims in cases. And so that, I think, is something that the government would certainly think about in negotiating a settlement, is how much of an impact will it have on the victims? Are we going to re-victimize them by putting them through this trial and potentially putting them through multiple other hearings as well, if it goes through and there's a conviction, those other things. So I think that's an important aspect to look at in a case like this.
Yeah. Welcome to everybody. I know there's a lot of first timers here. Surviving Survivor brings you the best guests in true crime every night of the week. And on Fridays, it's in the afternoon. And please be so kind, if you would, to hit that like, subscribe button. We'd appreciate it. Happy Chickadee here says that she supports the Goncalves family. I think most of us support the Goncalves family and understand the pain that they're in. The question of whether or not there should be a plea deal, I think, a lot of us have our own personal thoughts on that. But Aaron, to you, just getting back to Kaylee for a minute, and this is really difficult to even comprehend the fact that she was beaten, according to the family, before she tried to fight back. Everyone said she was, feisty, young, fairly strong, and she tried to fight back against this attacker. Ethan Chapin was apparently in the midst of sleep, so he didn't even know what was coming his way. But Kaylee got enough energy, at least, to try to fend him off, but was beaten. This sort of reframes the narrative. I'll say it makes you hate this guy even more, if that's possible, and that would have been a benefit to the government. So finding this out, does that change how you think at all? Finding some of these little smaller details that add up over time. Also, this issue with Ethan's legs. If all of this turns out to be absolute facts, then I don't know. Maybe this guy did deserve to go to trial, did deserve to ultimately end up in front of the firing squad. We just don't know if it ever would have. There's no guarantee it ever would have ended up there.
Well, exactly. And, I mean, this case to me, I think Anjanette said it, circumstantial cases can be really, really powerful. And the thing is that you have his DNA on a knife sheath next to two dead bodies. That is really, really compelling evidence. Is it the murder weapon? No. Is it the knife sheath that matches the knife that they believe is the murder weapon? Yes. And then, like we've said, we have everything else, right? We have his multiple trips back and forth to Moscow, to where the house is, right? From Washington, back and forth, and his phone's pinging off of the tower nearest the house. So his cell phone's pinging, but on the day of the murder, it doesn't ping. And sometimes the absence of evidence is also really compelling evidence. So there's your malice aforethought right there. He turned off his phone so that he couldn't be placed right there on that day. But all these other days when he's making this trip, he doesn't turn it off. He's just doing reconnaissance or whatever he considered it to be at that time. So, you've got that. You've got the camera where it shows that he's leaving at a high speed, at a high speed and barely makes a corner as he's leaving the property. So you've got that DNA evidence, which is really, really compelling to a jury. And then everything else, all of these other pieces, all of his Ted Bundy searches, all of his, his reordering a sheath for his knife, putting it in the Amazon bin, but then not checking out. All of that to me really just sort of shores this up to where this is a really strong case. That being said, because I know a lot of people are still, I keep reading the comments, but there's a lot of people who are still saying, they're the people who are going, well, there's no sure thing at trial. And that's the first conversation I would have with a victim of a violent crime, is, well, why can't we just go to trial? Okay, well, understand, we can do everything. We can fight until the very end, but there's a chance, even if it's a small chance, that he walks. And, some of them just couldn't even handle the thought of that. And then it was immediately, okay, I can't risk that. Because like I say, in a case like this, I think it was a small percentage. I think that we all would have gotten, it would have been the guilty. I do believe that. But that doesn't change the fact that there's a small chance that they might have acquitted. And I will tell you this, and Riley will probably disagree with me, but I will say juries, I've talked to so many juries. After my guilty pleas, I've had some hung juries where I had everybody but two, and I've talked to those people, and you talk to them and they all take this job very seriously. They're good people. They're doing the best they can, but that doesn't change the fact that sometimes, to me, they misapply reasonable doubt, right? It needs to be reasonable. It needs to be based on common sense, your doubt. So if you're looking for beyond a shadow of a doubt, that's not the burden. But I will tell you that I've talked to jurors, and it's not reasonable doubt. It's well, everything didn't fit together perfectly. This wasn't a Nancy Drew novel. Everything didn't fit in place, and so I just couldn't. And so that's a risk. That's a very, very serious risk. And then to answer the people who say that he deserved the death penalty, and I'm not saying, I'll just put it out there. I am pro death penalty, but at the same time, in the double murder case that I worked on, I talked to the family and I said, this is a long haul and we could have this done. And they were like, oh no, we want him to suffer in prison for decades. They were fine with that. But even somebody who believes, it has a place in our society because it's so extreme, we have so many safeguards in place that that so many more people die on death row than are ever actually executed. And that it just doesn't feel like justice either. So to take a 30-year-old and basically say, this is it, this is your life. The other thing too, that I wanted to say that I didn't get in on one of our episodes last week, so not to change the subject too much, but the other thing, I prosecuted sex offenders in my, I did other cases too, but the majority of my caseload was that. And the interesting thing, I can't remember, I think it might have been Phil Waters that was talking, but he was talking about how they're in their cell 23 hours a day. Keep in mind, Kohberger is not a sex offender, so he doesn't have to be protected. You know, those people will get shivved anywhere, right? So they have to keep them in their cell 23 hours a day because they don't have the manpower to babysit them. They're going to do the same thing with this monster. You know, he will have, 500 inmates at any point in time that would be looking to take him out, which means it's not like death. It's not necessarily like death row. It's worse. This is somebody who's going to be living in like a, whatever it is, 6x6 cell, 23 hours a day. And then they basically, all of the high risk people, they take out in groups and they get like 1 hour to go out and eat and shower and maybe see the sun. But the rest of the time, so can you imagine? That is justice. That is justice. 23 hours a day in a cage. And that's the rest of his life for as long as he lives.
I think, I hear you. I think Steve Goncalves would still disagree, but that is Steve Goncalves is right as a victim of the parents. And Jeanette, I know you have to run. Are you going
to say something about that?
Absolutely, please.
Part of me wonders, though, if Bryan Kohberger is kind of would be okay with that. I mean, he seems like a really introverted kind of guy. I mean, we've never heard that he's been really gregarious or, this is somebody with a lot of friends or anything. I mean, maybe he's like, okay, I mean, you know what I mean? This may be just fine by him, sitting in a cell with a stack of books and doing whatever it is Bryan Kohberger does all day long.
By the way, Dr. G,
academic,
he said the same thing. He said that he thought it wouldn't be that hard on him because he doesn't have the mind that we have where we would break. But Anjanette, are you planning to go to the sentencing?
Yes, I will be there.
And I think we'll be there as well for STS. So follow Anjanette and I will be at the sentencing. Anjanette, any final? Make sure you check out Anjanette's YouTube channel. She also hosts on Law and Crime. Anjanette, your final thoughts here.
I was thinking he might plead guilty. I just saw this shift in Ann Taylor over the last few months. Just this total shift. I didn't think the Ada County move was going the way she had hoped. And I'm not completely surprised, but it was still kind of a shock when it happened. And, I'll be interested to see if he was required by the prosecution behind closed doors to reveal anything about what he did with the murder weapon. That's what I'm wondering. If part of this plea agreement required him to disclose what he did with that. We didn't hear it obviously during the hearing, but I'm interested to hear whether or not there was if he had to reveal anything to the prosecution team or to detectives as part of this deal that we just don't know about yet.
We're going to find out. Anjanette, love having you on. Love hanging out with you when we're on the road, and I'll see you at the sentencing.
Looking forward to it. Okay. Yep. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Take care. So Lita Randolph here, can forensic psychologists study BK through interviews? It sounds like Riley I got a little more info from the chat that apparently you can do phone interviews, not in-person interviews. I'm going to defer to Riley, who's a federal defender and knows the state of Idaho, but he will undoubtedly be interviewed and studied by some of these forensic psychologists. And by the way, if you are new to STS, in the weeks leading up to Bryan Kohberger's arrest, we had the living legend, Dr. Ann Burgess, on, who literally started the criminal profiling field back in the 60s. And she was on with Gary Bricado, who studies serial killers. And they essentially profiled Bryan Kohberger to a T before we knew who Bryan Kohberger was. And wouldn't you know it, this week, I've got to go get my daughters at camp along with the COE, and we're going to re-air that later in the week. It's really fascinating to watch it now, so keep your eyes open for that. On Instagram, we're at Surviving the Survivor. On Twitter, at Podcast STS. So Instagram, Surviving the Survivor. Twitter, it is at Podcast STS, because someone took Surviving the Survivor. How about that? So some of the new evidence. So Riley, to you, the government, it's interesting in this country, the way things work. So the government was essentially compelled to reveal their evidence ahead of the plea agreement, ahead of him actually pleading guilty, but he wasn't compelled to say exactly what happened. But that is the way this system works here. So amongst the things, we'll go through this now. This is the evidence that was unveiled during the plea hearing. DNA on the knife sheath. That's the big one. A K-bar knife purchase on Amazon months before the killings. Deleted search history, which was porn related to Ted Bundy and other deviant things on his search history. And perhaps the one getting the most attention today, a Q-tip from the trash pulled at his parents' home, matching Bryan Kohberger's father. So this is Q-tip DNA. Between the DNA on the knife sheath, the K-bar knife purchase, the deleted history, this Q-tip DNA, Riley, what sticks out to you? There's more to go, but so far, what sticks out to you the most?
So DNA evidence is something that juries love, but don't always fully understand, because there's some weaknesses to DNA evidence. So the fact that there's his evidence on a knife sheath, that gives you limited information. It doesn't tell you what his motive is. It doesn't tell you how he did things. It doesn't tell you any of those details, but it does at least place him there. DNA had to have been placed at some point, either through touch or trace or anything like that. So we know, because of the DNA, that that knife sheath was around him, and he must have been there. And so that goes towards this the circumstantial evidence in the case. So I think that's their strongest piece of evidence to show he was there that time. He was there that night. All the rest of the cell phone pings, the data from the cell towers, the path his car took, the path his car took, even careening out of the home that night, or in the early morning, even then, that's still not the strongest evidence. It's the DNA evidence, because it puts him there. It doesn't answer all the questions, but because you don't know when it got there or the circumstances it got there, but you know that it was there, and so he would have been there. Now, there's a lot of things that you can extrapolate from the evidence. So how strong the DNA evidence, how much they pull from that can help. And the one piece that stands out to me is that it was a single source. Aaron knows this. When we're dealing with DNA evidence, you're often having multiple contributors. So in an essay case or something like that, you're going to have at least 2, sometimes 3 or more contributors, and that makes it difficult to analyze the DNA and really pinpoint it to who could be a statistical match. Where there's one source of DNA, that really makes it strong that this DNA came from one person, not from multiple people. This knife wasn't passed around. This wasn't, a community knife. It was personal property of Mr. Kohberger. And that makes a huge difference.
And Riley, let me ask you, I mean, how do you account for the fact that there was no blood DNA, virtually no evidence in the house, none in the car, which he had time to clean, but the house gets me every time. Your thoughts on that?
Well, aside from doing his best to cover things up, whether it be through gloves or anything like that, but also it comes down to, there's going to be a lot of DNA from anybody there. So when we know that the victims all live there, if there's friends or family coming and going, he's coming and going. So just because they can't find DNA in the rest of the place, it may be because they can't extrapolate whose DNA is there. They could get a sample from a bedpost and go, okay, well, there's 4 or 5 contributors. Statistically, we can't determine whose DNA is a part of those 4 or 5 contributors. So aside from just knowing there's 4 or 5 contributors, the DNA analytics aren't strong enough to be able to extrapolate statistically who's a part of that. So I imagine that his DNA is there, but whether they can point out and say, we can piece it out of all this other DNA noise, that I don't think is as easy to do. So having the single source there, that one they can nail down.
So there were also some of the other evidence laid out by Bill Thompson at the plea agreement, 23 late night phone pings, which Dateline broke that on May 9th near the crime scene. Over 4 months, over a 4-month period, a phone turned off during the murders and back on at 4:48 a.m., presumably Bryan's phone. Bryan Kohberger returns to the crime scene around 9 a.m. and takes that creepy that creepy ass selfie video by the shower. COE, I don't know if you have that to put it up, but no one really needs to see that again. So that is obviously all very important stuff. Aaron, to you, this comment stood out to me from Tiger Beat. Ann Taylor wanting to accuse up to 4 innocent people bothers me. Like, we all know that lawyering is a high stakes chess game, right? I'm just curious your take on this. You know, she has a job to do, but it should never be at the peril of innocent people. And, you know, there was this alternate suspect theory. It did include up to 4 other people. He himself just said, I did this. I mean, what would have happened if this went to trial and those 4 people who are now essentially accused by Ann Taylor, the public defender, actually play a factor in this, and people think that they are the ones who do it? I mean, ethically, what is the responsibility of a prosecutor? And I'll ask Riley the same thing, because he's doing that day in and day out in his practice right now.
Right. Well, he's a defense attorney. But so, I mean, as a prosecutor, and this was one of the hard things. We would get, police go and they investigate a crime that's been reported. And we have an ethical obligation that if we don't believe we can prove something beyond a reasonable doubt, we can't charge it. And that's really important, that a lot of people don't understand, is that if, we can't say, well, we'll charge it and then we'll get him to take a plea deal for less because we don't have enough to prove it at trial. That's unethical. We can't do that. So every single case, we are looking at whether or not we can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt at the charging stage. So, I mean, there were victims I had to call and I had to say, I'm sorry, I can't, we just don't have enough evidence. And there were tears and, and those are hard conversations when you just say, I'm sorry, it's not that I don't believe you, I just can't prove this case. And we have to make those decisions all the time. In this one, what you need to remember is, and I do civil defense, very different than criminal defense. I've never been a criminal defense attorney. I've only been on the prosecution side. But from my perspective, this is about reasonable doubt, and she was hoping that by bringing up these 4 other, very, very loose contacts that these kids had with these other 4 individuals, that maybe it'll be enough in one juror's mind, right? It's got to be unanimous, one juror's mind, and they can hang that jury. Well, then all of a sudden, now the state's like, oh my gosh, okay, well, we could retry the case, but what if the same thing happens again? Because they've been able to create reasonable doubt. And if you can hang a jury, then all of a sudden the state's in a worse position of now trying to say, okay, we'll plead to everything and we'll take the death penalty off the table. Because now if they get a hung jury or 2 hung juries trying this case, then you realize that maybe there's a real problem. So I think that you need to differentiate those 4 people. They were never, law enforcement does their best. They go in, they follow all of their leads until there's nothing more to it. And they never put forth any of those people as suspects. So those people never would have been investigated. They were never going to be charged. Because as the judge said, there was not a scintilla of evidence tying them to these crimes. And so nothing was ever going to happen to those 4 people. It was really just, it was a desperate grab for reasonable doubt. That's my take on it. Riley may have follow up on that, because I mean, he's on that side and understands the value of if you can get a little bit of reasonable doubt in there.
Yeah. And by the way, I want to say there was obviously a lot of blood in the house, but nothing that linked definitively Bryan Kohberger. So that is an important distinction. I'm glad that someone made that correction in the chat. But analyst said, Ann Taylor said a couple months ago that going to trial is a battle of storytelling. It sure is. Lawyers are storytellers. But what about where Aaron left off there? I mean, the question really is, what is the ethical obligation of these public defenders? The fact that Ann Taylor had this alternate suspect theory, it was quashed by the judge ultimately, but was she about to, throw 4 people down the river just to get her client off?
Well, I think Aaron had a lot of good things to say about that. If I, as a defense attorney at a trial, present evidence that I think there's some alternative theory, an alternative suspect or something like that, that doesn't create jeopardy in that other person. As in, if the person's acquitted, that doesn't mean that the government then has the duty or the evidence necessary to go track those other people down and bring the crime against them. So that there's no legal jeopardy that puts a person, or that a defense attorney puts another person into by so trying to advance an argument for an alternative suspect. The defense attorney, though, does have.
Hate when the Wi-Fi goes out. So this is the timeline, and Riley might actually, he's on his phone right now. It's possible he's getting a call at the moment. So let's see if he pops back on here. But here's the timeline real quick to see how we put this together. I just want to go back over it, and then there's some other points we've got to hit before we get final thoughts. But 9 p.m. the night of November 12th, which leads into the murders. Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin are seen at Chapin's fraternity party.
I think I cut out there. Am I back now?
Yeah, you did cut out. Yeah, yep, you're back, Riley. You can pick up where you were at. Riley, if you have us, feel free to pick up.
There we go. Sorry.
No worries.
So the defense attorney does have an ethical obligation to zealously represent their client. That's the whole purpose behind having an attorney represent you. And there's a lot of truth to the fact that
and that was a tease. We're going to bounce him out until the COE gets that right. And we are now down to one. So Goncalves, that's Kaylee, of course, uploads an Instagram post, one lucky girl to be surrounded by these people every day. And that is the photo that you see so often where they're on each other's shoulders right there. That is the timeline. And then we go to this 1:30, Kaylee Goncalves and Maddie get food from the food truck. 1:45, Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin arrive to Xana's home on King Road. 1:56 a.m., Goncalves and Maddie Mogan take a car ride home. 3:30, Kohberger's white Hyundai drives by the home on King Road, does a loop, and we know that Dateline has that, so we know the government would have had that. 3:38 a.m., Kohberger drives by again and circles home. 3:56, Kohberger drives by once again and circles the home. DoorDash driver arrives at 3:59. 4:04, Kohberger pulls over in front of the home, drives off, then does a 3-point turn and circles back. Camera catches him at 4:07 near a back parking lot. And then this final one, Kohberger at 4:13 is believed to have made entry into the house on King Road. He went into Maddie's room first. That's why people think she was the target. 4:16, Xana's phone app activity stops. Dylan hears something. She's the roommate and texts her roommates. White Hyundai Elantra seen leaving the neighborhood quickly. Dateline had that. It's almost like he peels out. WSU, Washington State cameras capture Kohberger on camera. So that is essentially the timeline there. But there is another important point. Riley, you're muted, but let us know. Are you back with us? You're good? All righty. So Howard Blum has been on this show a number of times. He has a book, When Night Comes Falling, or When Night Falls, about this case. And he had some reporting today. He says that Kohberger's attorney had for a while, Ann Taylor for a while, wanted a plea deal to avoid execution by firing squad. But Marianne Kohberger, Bryan's mother, was the one who was resisting this, urging him to not plead guilty and resist the deal. The defense had floated an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. That was all part of it. A critical turning point here. The defense warns Kohberger, Riley, that his own family, his father, mother, and possibly a sister would be called to testify at trial. We find that out. But then what we find out today, or at least I found out today, some of you may have known this through other channels, but Howard Blum said there was a 6 a.m. phone call made to a phone registered to Bryan Kohberger's father the morning of the murders, after the murders occurred. And that was believed to be a big potential liability for the defense going forward. And then, of course, we know that Bryan Kohberger's father drives cross country to pick him up and bring him back. So, Riley, What do you make of the fact that, according to this report, Bryan Kohberger calls his father at 6 a.m.? A lot of people have said, and I'm not suggesting this right now, but a lot of people have said in the past they think the father knows more, the father knew more. How would the proverbial legal door have been opened if this went to trial and they were called as witnesses? In particular, the 6 a.m. call from Bryan Kohberger to his dad.
So I think there's some evidence issues to think about in getting a statement like that in, or getting that conversation in. I think there would have to be some type of indication of what that conversation may have entailed. So I think the government would have needed to have proffered to some extent, this conversation has some link or some context to the killings. If they can do that, so that would overcome a foundational challenge. But if they can do something like that, the conversation between the father and Kohberger would be admissible. As in, Kohberger's statements are always going to be able to come in because he's the defendant, and you don't have the if you make statements, your right to remain silent is essentially waived, right? So part of the government's case could be calling anyone that he has talked to, so long as they can lay the foundation that it's going to be pertinent in the trial. They can elicit statements from what Kohberger said through them.
It was apparently, according to Kel and others, a 53-minute call. The way I heard it, it was to his father. Others are saying it's to the mother. But either way, Aaron, this definitely raises a lot of red flags and antennae. The fact that he's calling, someone said he was in a manic state. I assume he was. The question is, what did he tell them during that call? Do you think that's something that may have been revealed if this trial went forward, potentially incredibly damning, not just to Bryan Kohberger, but to his parents? And does it all end here? Now that we know this, will that call be scrutinized?
Probably not. I mean, if the call is not recorded, right? We know it existed because there's the record of the call. The only two people who know the content of the call are, Kohberger and his father, right? They're the only two that were on there. The interesting thing about that is that there is no privilege, between a father and a son, or if it was the mom between a mother and a son, there's no privilege that prevents her from having to testify. If they were worried about somehow being accomplices or something like that, because we have to assume, I think that with the chain of events, I think it's fair to speculate that he was having some kind of a meltdown, right? Something is happening. Whether or not he disclosed what he did is really what we'll never know, but we'll always wonder, unless his father eventually writes a book or something and talks about that phone call. Then that's really the only way I see us knowing now. Now, if his father, should have been, as soon as they found out about that phone call, law enforcement should have interviewed father to see if he would, admit, like to talk about the content of it. The interesting part there is that if they believed that they could be basically charged with something for somehow being an accomplice, aiding and abetting, right? Something like that in the aftermath of this crime, then they could plead the fifth. The interesting thing about the fifth, people always think about, they can just plead the fifth and then they don't have to testify. The interesting thing is that the state can give them immunity. We can say, no matter what you tell us, we will not charge you. And if we put that in writing, then the fifth will protect you because you might incriminate yourself. If you have protection to where you will not be prosecuted for anything that you say, then you don't have that protection anymore. So it would have been kind of an interesting thing. And I think that it would have been relevant just because of the timing of everything. I think that it would have been very relevant because, it started with a phone call, an hour and 12 minutes after he left the house. And now these 4 kids are dead. And then his father drives out and then, across the country to drive back with him back home. So I think that it would have been everything. I mean, what did they talk about for all those hours in the car? And what did the parents know? So I think that would have all been very interesting. But like I say, unless the father at some point decides to do some kind of tell-all. We may never know really how much they knew. That's all it kind of goes away, you're right, with this plea agreement on knowing the extent of what everybody else knew.
Yeah, and Riley, do you agree with Aaron on that the call sort of dies here with this plea agreement? The fact that Kohberger either calls the father or the mother. It's a 53-minute call. That could be incredibly incriminating, not just for Bryan, but for the parents. But do you think it just dies on the vine now as a result?
I agree with Aaron. I think that's accurate. Unless there's some other indication, some interview that police do with them, or something else that ferrets out some information of the content of the call, then I mean it doesn't go anywhere. And there's nothing that could compel it, I think, to come out as well.
A couple other things I want to get to for sure. So they've interviewed some of his childhood friends since this plea agreement. One said that they believe he did it because we're talking motive. That is a question that has everyone scratching their head. Why did he do this to begin with? One friend says to, quote unquote, experience what it feels like, meaning to kill. A classmate from Washington State University, who he obviously knew much later in life, described him as an abyss, a hollow entity, not human. And now the friends, of course, are questioning, how did we miss these warning signs? And they're also thankful that they are still here. Now, also, Dr. Catherine Ramsland, she was supposed to be live on our show last week. She had to step away because of legal issues going on, but did speak to the New York Times, and that came out. She's obviously a renowned serial killer expert. And to the New York Times, she said that she saw him as polite, engaged, interested, and researched. She was shocked by his alibi, the stargazing alibi. She said that's not an alibi, and it's not. That's her direct quote. And she was not at all surprised that he took the plea once his legal defense collapsed. But she said she, who studies serial killers for a living, did not see this coming. I know this isn't really in your purview per se, Aaron, but just your thoughts on the fact that a renowned expert on serial killers who studied the notorious BTK, bind, torture, kill serial killer, comes out and tells the New York Times, I didn't see this coming at all. What do you think that says about either she or Bryan Kohberger?
Well, and I think that, I've known a lot of messed up people during my time as a prosecutor, and they fool a lot of people, including people with psychopathic traits, right? That have so little emotion, and like that one friend saying that he was hollow, that he wasn't human. That very much kind of fits that. But a lot of them too, if they're smart, they're really, really good at camouflage. And they can kind of, fly under the radar. It surprises me a little bit. But to that point, though, a lot of what I did as prosecutor, dealing with the child abuse, so much of that, it seems sexual in nature, but it actually is more about power and control. And even the pornography that you guys were talking about that he was watching, to me, you have to remember is that so often even rape is really a crime of violence. It's not a crime. It's not a sex crime. And so to say that this was sexually motivated, I think that you need to kind of remember that even the kind of thing that he was watching was so much more about power and control. And I think I've just seen so much of that personality type in my career, where it just kind of shows itself over and over again. And the number of people that to this day, even though their significant other is now doing 25 to life or something, just absolutely not. He would never, they got it wrong. The jury got it wrong. The prosecutor needs to, burn in hell, those kind of comments. Right. But I mean, that's how good their camouflage is sometimes, is that these people, even the people closest to them, are just so completely snowed by it. But what they do, so much of this, it's about power and control. And all of the, counselors and therapists that are trained in child abuse and things like that, they use that term over and over again. And I think that his behavior this, just targeting these, even if it was, you're too pretty for me, which I know there was a kind of a comment. He was never going to get a pretty blonde to be his girlfriend. But what's he doing? He's taking power and control over that girl he can't have. So it still is more about, in my mind, it's more about the power and control than it is being, a sexual act. Because I know we were having that conversation earlier. But I don't know. I think it's a little scary how good they fool the people around them often.
Yeah, they're phenomenal at that. And they fooled one of the, I guess, best known studiers of serial killers, Cauliflower. Love the name. Let's be honest. People don't study folks before they become serial killers. They are studied after. Hindsight is always 2020. So now I've got the defense attorneys acting as profilers. One other thing that caught my attention today, there is a forensic psychiatrist, not a psychologist, but a psychiatrist who's been around forever, Dr. Carol Lieberman. She was interviewed, and she believes everyone's looking for a why here. That's human nature, to try to figure out the why. She believes that Bryan Kohberger fixated on Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves because they resembled a middle school cheerleader who once rejected Bryan Kohberger. COE, I don't know if we have the photo of that person. I don't know if you even want to bring it up. She calls it a quote-unquote magnified revenge on that cheerleader, essentially saying it's every woman who has ever turned him down. But she does look eerily similar to Kaylee, and more to Maddie Mogen, I would say. She looks eerily similar. Who knows if that's the reason? Apparently, he was following the victims on Instagram, message one, slipping into their DMs, the ping showing 23 visits to the house. But apparently, there was definitely some sort of obsession here. So that is definitely of interest. But the final question, of course, is, was justice served in this case? The sentencing is set for July 23rd. SCS is going to be there. And then we've got the Stefan Stearns case. Testimony in that case starts 2 days later. So we'll be back for Stefan Stearns. But Riley, to you, that's the question. Has or will justice be served in this case? Bryan Kohberger going away for life without the possibility of parole? Or is this going to be something that just forever hangs over the case, that he could have been put to death? Obviously going to be something that gnaws at the Goncalves family and the Kernodle family from here till eternity. But was justice served, Riley?
I think that's a good question. That's something that I've been thinking about the last week, as I've been watching the change of plea and seeing it all live, well, on video. One thing that I've learned through the last 13 years now practicing in state and federal court, our justice system is not always super great at actually giving justice, and justice is going to look different to pretty much every other person. So the Goncalveses have a different view of justice than what somebody else might have. But there's one thing that this does that is very rare in the criminal justice system, and that is closure. To me, the biggest thing in this case is he's waiving his appeal rights, he's waiving his Rule 35 rights. He's waiving every substantive post-conviction right that he has. That, to me, is a really big deal, because once the sentencing is done in this case, it's closed. Even after a conviction happens, the person can still say, it wasn't me, I didn't do it, it was somebody else. Even after those scenarios, you're going to have an appeal. You're going to have them coming back into court. They're going to be the victims are going to be contacted again to be told what's going on. It's constantly going to be coming back. This now can actually be closure. And I think everyone would agree with me, in 13 years of practicing, that is not something that happens very often. That is not something that happens where you can just say, we can close this door and we can say legally it's finished. So I think that that's a really big deal. If he had just agreed to life in prison without parole, but still maintained his rights to appeal, he would have won. That would have been a win for him. But in this case, it's closing the door, and I think at the end of the day, I think it will be good for the victims. I think it's good for the people of Idaho not to have a lengthy litigation process for years and years. And at the end of the day, it is a death sentence. Kohberger will die in prison. There's no question about that, and his life will be miserable, at least by all of our standards. So I think, at least in my sense of justice, I think it checks so many of those boxes. Now, I'm not one of the victims, so I can't speak for them, but I think from those perspectives, I really think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. It is, Thomas Creech is a death row inmate in Idaho. I think he entered death row in the 1970s, I believe, if I'm correct. And, they tried to put him to death a year and change ago, and they couldn't get to his vein with lethal injection. He was too dehydrated. You just never know what's going to go wrong. And I'm not saying this to sort of deflate Steve Goncalves's ire, because I feel for that guy, and he's allowed to be as angry as he wants. But something as crazy and sort of unexpected as a vein not taking the injection could prevent someone from actually being put to death. But this, in a way, you just heard Riley say it, is about as 100%, I guess, confirmation that his life will play out in a state prison without any chance of parole. It's about as certain of that as you can get. It's not death, but it is a pretty horrible existence, if you ask me. So final question, and I would love STS Nation. I'd love to include you guys. I always say best guest, better community. You can see that behind my shoulder there. We have the best, not just true crime, but we've got the best community in all the YouTubes. Aaron, I'm going to put you on the spot. If you could ask Bryan Kohberger a single question, just one question, what would you ask him? And STS, feel free to email us, survivingthesurvivor@gmail.com, survivingthesurvivor@gmail.com, and let us know the answer to that question. But Aaron, what is your answer to what's the one question you would ask? I guess outside of maybe why do you do this? Because I think we all want to know that. But what else would you ask?
See, the hard thing about that is that when you say that, my mind goes to actually having him on the stand and being able to cross it, which leads to 100 questions, right? Because if he, and this was one thing that I think Riley would agree with, and I know Riley can vouch for this. I think that most defense attorneys do not want their client to take the stand. I have had many defendants take the stand, and I've had that opportunity. And the problem is that he has kind of a cornucopia of things to go through. Oh, you were looking at the stars? Well, how come you kept looking for stars by that house on King Road? How come you were doing it overnight? Why were you, where's your and I'm sorry, what's it called? The knife, the
sheath, the nice sheath.
Right. No, but the name of the knife.
Oh, K-bar.
Thank you, K-bar. So where's your K-bar? Because this was your sheath, right? It's got your DNA on it. And then you almost bought another one. There are so many of these questions that he would have really no answer for, because I 100% believe that he's guilty. I think that this is a very just resolution to the whole thing. But he has so many things that would kind of, if he got up there to say, I was out looking at the stars, I never went to that house, I had lost my, right? Because that's something they can always say, oh, I lost my knife sheath. That's why I was looking to buy another one. I lost it somewhere. Somebody must have picked it up and carried it into the house, but it wasn't mine. But my DNA was probably on it, right? Like I'm not saying, they're good liars. They can come up with alternative stories, but there's so many things. There's so many things that he just wouldn't be able to put together. So I guess it's kind of hard for me to say one question when all my brain goes into is being able to actually cross him on the stand about all these pieces of evidence. There's the DNA evidence, which is of course the strongest, but if he tries to weasel out of that, we've got 25 other little pieces that he'll have no explanation for.
Aaron, that was answered like an attorney, but I like it. Attorneys and politicians, they never give you the straight answer, but I love it. But it was good enough for me. These are the four that this is all about. You've got Kaylee Goncalves, top left. You've got Madison Mogan, top right. Xana Kernodle, whose family is very upset as well, bottom right. And you've got Ethan Chapin, who was a triplet. His siblings need to go on as just a pair now, which is especially sad. The COE, if you don't know, if you're new to the show, she is the chief of everything. We all have one. She's also my wife, also a former network news correspondent. We put the show on with Space Coast on the West Coast. He handles all things tech. We get the best guests because of Meave Moen, Steve Cohen, who is the best at what he does. And, of course, our great mods who get us rolling through each and every show. We're going to be back tomorrow. There's a Diddy hearing, planning to do another show related to Bryan Kohberger. I've also been in touch. We met people along the way who live in the Moscow, Pullman area, Moscow, Idaho, Pullman, Washington, where Washington State University is. And Cindy, I'm talking to you. We're going to try to record something. She doesn't know this yet. Tomorrow that we can air while we're away for a couple of days. And if you've never heard of the Ellen Greenberg case, I urge you to Google it. Probably, in my opinion, one of the biggest miscarriages of justice that I have ever heard about or been a part of in terms of reporting. Stabbed 20 times, 10 to the very back of her neck, 10 to the back of her head, 10 to the front, with a deep knife wound in her chest that her fiance never noticed, never gave her CPR. He was never investigated. The case was ruled a homicide on night one, then eventually switched over to undetermined. And after a closed-door meeting with corrupt Philly politicians, law enforcement that weren't even supposed to be in on the meeting, and medical examiners, they switched her manner of death to a self-unaliving, despite a lot of evidence to the contrary. And Ellen's parents have reached out. Nancy Grace has a book out on this case right now, and we're going to try to get Ellen's parents back on while we're away, which the COE doesn't know either. So justice for Ellen Greenberg. If you look at the 3D imaging that was made of this particular case and how how her life ended, you'll be in disbelief that this is being called a self-unaliving. Absolutely in disbelief. It seems impossible, and I think it is impossible. And perhaps there is a killer wandering loose right now. But amazing to have our best guests, Riley Fry, Aaron Tognetti, both attorneys in the great state of Idaho. Beautiful state. And I'll be out there for the sentencing. Thank you so much. Love you, America. Love you for being here. We are getting some semblance of justice, but of course, this is about the Idaho4. Bryan Kohberger, as far as I'm concerned, can rot in prison the rest of his life. We will be back tomorrow to bring you more. We will see you then. Love you, everybody. Aaron and Riley, stick around for one quick